guys, it's Sandro here, and welcome to part 2 and the paint correction stage of the detail on this Mercedes S500. Now as a whole, I wouldn't say that the paint is in horrible condition, but I would say that it could benefit from a quality but respectful paint correction process to eliminate the existing defects, which include quite a few buffer holograms and compound or polish residue left over from the last time the paint was corrected, as well as a uniform layer of light swirls mixed in with some more moderate wash-induced scratches. Apart from that, I can also see some random water spots here and there and an obvious layer of haze and oxidation that once removed and refined should restore this paint back to a rich and vibrant finish. As far as paint thickness goes, it could definitely be better, but considering the age of the vehicle, it could also be worse. Now in some areas, such as the large flat panel areas, especially on the top half of the vehicle, some of the readings are dangerously thin and as low as 85 microns. While in the other finer panel areas, where it's harder to fit a large buffing pad, or on the lower panels that are sometimes overlooked, the paint thickness readings are up to twice as thick, topping out at about 160 microns, which is what I'd much prefer to see. For someone who measures and inspects a lot of car paint and has become pretty good at reading and predicting a paint's history, this is just a classic example of someone using a large rotary wool pad to aggressively cut the paint back, which is further supported by the strong rotary holograms left in the finish. It's really unfortunate that this has happened because it's just so unnecessary and so disrespectful to the car and the paint's longevity. And what's more, it makes my job here, or really anyone who polishes the car in the future, a far more stressful and limiting process because someone has decided to hack into this paint for no good reason. Additionally, based on my inspection, the front right quarter panel has been resprayed in the past. But apart from that, the rest of the paint in the car as a whole seems to be completely original. So with all the trims masked up, it was time for a test section to see what compound, pad and technique this paint responds best to. Now, as I mentioned in part 1 of this series, every car, customer, job and budget is different, which requires a different approach to address those needs in the best possible manner. Now ideally, based on the time I've already spent on the decontamination process and the interior, plus the time I'll need to ceramic coat the paint, it would be ideal to find a single stage correction, which will give me more time to focus on addressing the intricate areas. Plus, based on my paint thickness measurements, I'd also prefer to remove as little clear coat as possible in a single stage correction. Now, it's quite obvious that a superfine polish and superfine finishing pad just aren't going to address these existing defects based on my past experience, also taking into account that this is most likely going to be a hard Mercedes paint. So my starting point for a test section was using a medium compound and an intermediate foam pad in the form of Scholl Concepts S20 Black on the blue Scholl Concepts Spider pad. So although you should always start with the least aggressive method, it also has to have the potential to work, or else you're just needlessly wasting time. I'm using the Rupes Millet Polisher with just light pressure on speed 4.5, working about a half meter square section and just doing 3-row passes with a slowish arm speed, which is my general starting technique. Now, being that this is a metallic paint that also tends to blow out on camera, it's going to be a little harder to clearly see the defects and results in the footage compared to a flat or non-metallic paint, but I'll do my best to talk you through what I was seeing here in person. Firstly, as far as gloss and clarity goes, this first moderate combination worked quite well to remove a lot of the haze and light swirls while clearly improving the finish. Though I wouldn't say that it was perfect at this stage, as I could still see some light oxidation in place. But as far as addressing the more random and moderate scratches, it's only addressed about half of them. So I would need at least a slightly more aggressive approach to remove more of them, as I am chasing a high level of correction and result for my client. For a second test section, I stuck with Scholl Concepts S20, but stepped up to the light cutting white spider pad to hopefully remove a few more of the existing defects. Additionally, I also upped my machine speed to 5 and used a little more moderate pressure to hopefully maximize this pad's cutting ability without compromising its finishing ability, or at least that was my goal for the outcome. Now, having a look at the results, this was by far a much better outcome in every aspect, as the finish was better and really just about perfect with fantastic gloss and clarity levels, removing all of the oxidation and existing haze, while also removing about 80% or so of the deeper random scratches. However, although I know it's hard to see in the footage, 20% of the existing scratches still remaining just isn't quite acceptable for a higher result. So although I was close, I still needed just a touch more cut to get that quality result. And I should also mention that based on the finish being so good with this moderate combination, but still needing more cut to remove the moderate defects, this was a clear sign that it was in fact a harder paint type. For a third test section, I stuck with the white spider pad but stepped up to Scholl Concepts S3 Gold. The goal here would be to retain the great finish that this pad achieved in the previous section, but to hopefully get into that 90 to 95% defect removal range. And seeing that my technique worked perfectly in the previous test section, I stuck with the same polishing method. Having a look at the results in this third test section, it actually worked perfectly to remove 95% plus of the defects, which was great considering that this still was what I consider to be just a light cutting combination. However, the finish wasn't nearly as good as the previous section, as S3 left behind a layer of fine haze that would need a second step to refine, which, as I mentioned earlier, really isn't ideal for various reasons. So for a fourth test section, I went back to Scholl S20, but this time tried it on the Rupes medium wool pad. You'll also notice that I primed this pad, whereas I don't tend to prime my foam pads, simply for the fact that foam pads tend to self-prime quite easily and rapidly in my experience, whereas fibre-based pads tend to need that initial prime before use. Now, as a whole, this section definitely showed the best balance of cut and defect removal, which was perfectly in that 95% range and seemed to be a touch less aggressive than the previous section, while still finishing almost perfectly with just the slightest amount of haze in the finish that was barely noticeable. So being that this combination was going to be more respectful in retaining as much of the clear coat as possible while still removing enough of the existing defects for that high end result, I decided to try this same combination again, but with a slight tweak in my technique to see if I could get it to finish perfectly. So after giving the pad a good blowout and just using 2 small drops of the compound for this next section, I also slightly lowered my machine speed and eased off the pressure, making sure that I didn't overwork the paint and kept the heat down to a minimum. As I've mentioned in past videos, things like reducing the amount of compound on the pad and lowering machine speeds can help your combination finish better, while doing the complete opposite can help increase your cutting ability, or at least in general, as it ultimately comes down to what the specific paint responds best to. Having a look at this test section, it actually worked perfectly, still removing 95% of the defects, but this time also finishing perfectly without that slight haze that I could see in the previous section. So with just some slight tweaks in my technique that I just mentioned, I was able to get this combination with Scholl Concepts S20 on the Rupes yellow wall pad to do exactly what I wanted it to do on this paint and for this job, which was well worth the effort of taking the time to further explore it. This S500 is a big car with a lot of real estate, which in itself makes it a time-consuming car to correct. But high-end detailing is really all about the finer details, and you'll see throughout this job that I spent quite a bit of time with my smaller 1 and 2 inch DA and rotary polishers trying to restore the many intricate trims throughout this vehicle, which made it a doubly time consuming job. And being that the paint is rather thin in quite a few areas, the last thing you want to do is use a larger polishing pad on those areas, as it would lead to burning through this paint. I also noticed that on many of these finer trims, the only real defects were fine swirls, oxidation, and a little haze, so the Rupes yellow foam pad was more than capable of removing them.
What is this meaning? I live my life, but it seems I can't escape from this duality. I am so different from whom I've been, and now I've been so tired of your rules, trying to consume all the words that you choose. But I never had a chance to decide which way to ride. Somebody else speaking my mind. I've been broken down. I won't turn around. I've grown sick and tired of you telling me to swim upstream and undermine me. My eyes and blind me. Can't define me. You're so wrong. Why trust these seeds of regret when there is so much for me to learn yet? I'm so nearly consumed by it all. We don't know.
You'll also see that as per usual, I used my 3 and 2 inch polishers and pads to correct the paint around the panel edges, which is also far less aggressive on those sensitive edges, while still obtaining a much better and safer result than using a large pad and machine to polish those susceptible areas. And once I'm done with all the delicate and time consuming trim and edge work, my final step was the flat work with my larger polisher and pads for the home stretch. Now once again, it's never as easy trying to capture a metallic paint on camera, and this beautiful shade of paint has a lot of metallic flakes in its finish, which makes it doubly hard. But you'll still hopefully be able to see that it was quite an amazing transformation as the paint just began to glow with vibrancy after the bonnet was corrected.
You choose, but I never had a chance to decide which way to ride. Somebody else speaking my mind. I've been broken down. I won't turn around. I've grown sick and tired of you telling me to swim upstream and undermine me. My eyes and blind me. Can't define me. You're so wrong. Trust these seeds of regret when there is so much for me to so pitiful, wondering why I am so critical. I've been broken down, I won't turn around. I've grown sick and tired of you telling me to swim upstream and undermine me. My eyes and blind me. You can't define me, you're so wrong. Where could I belong though? My situation won't end so. I'm caught between my heart and myself. Is there any way to break this spell? Well, I won't worry, I won't sweat it. I'll cross the bridge before I made it. My time will never come if I give myself up before I'm done. Ooh. I've been broken down, I won't turn around. I've grown sick and tired of you telling me to swim upstream and undermine me. My eyes and blind me. Can't define me, you're so wrong. Yeah, yeah, I've been broken down, I won't turn around. Yeah, 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 yeah. Come on.
Hey man, what's up? I'm just like chilling, I guess. I don't know, man. I think I might just take the rest of the day and, just chill. I'm chill. Are you chill? We chill. Alright.
We were rolling through the ages, taking bits and pieces, pages, not so good with names or faces. Take a walk with Mother Nature, feel her inclination and become incapable of hatred. We can skip the arbitration, no concern for what you're chasing. I am chill, your heart is racing. Why don't you pour a glass of red, come join me on the bed instead, and let this chronic infiltrate your head. And then we're gone, we only live inside this song. And when you're gone, the only time I feel alone.
I'm chill.
Now, as I mentioned, during the paint inspection, there were quite a few water spots and slight etchings on the vehicle, most of which were on the glass. So polishing glass is a great way to remove water spots and etchings, as well as any environmental or traffic film buildup that doesn't come off during the decontamination stage. And apart from restoring the glass back to its crystal clear finish, it's also a great way to prepare glass for a sealant or glass coating. And as I've also mentioned many times in the past, you really don't have to overthink it or use any specialty glass polish. I just tend to use whatever I'm using at the time to polish the car for the glass, as glass is a very forgiving surface to work with that almost always finishes perfectly due to its extreme hardness.
Cause when I mention you
As I continue with the correction process, that should be fairly self-explanatory. I'll just touch on a few, hopefully helpful points. Now, I've worked on many older 70s, 80s and 90 Mercedes in my time, and I can say without a doubt that the older Mercs were some of the greatest and over-engineered cars with some of the best paint and trim finishes in the car world. But that's just not the case anymore with Mercedes, or really almost any car manufacturers today. When this car was originally painted, it probably had well over 200 microns of paint applied, whereas today you're just not going to see that anymore. And in many cases, you won't even see half that paint thickness on brand new cars. And this also extends to the quality of the materials used, both on the interior and exterior trims of a car, that just don't age as well or last as long, and in many cases, as a detailer, we're pretty much limited as to what we can do on new cars compared to older ones that were just made to last. Just think, if this car had been given 100 microns of paint 20 years ago, it simply wouldn't have lasted, and it either would have had to be repainted or potentially just scrapped because of the high cost of doing that. And that's a real shame, but the reality of new cars that are simply made to be cheap and disposable cars, and not the same cars that our parents and their parents had for many, many decades or even longer. So I guess what I'm saying is that as detailers, our options are being greatly diminished every single year as cars get less and less paint applied, and the quality of trims and materials are getting so cheap and nasty that trying to correct and restore them might very well destroy them even further. So the risk of being a detailer and burning through the paint or damaging trims is just getting so much worse. To put it simply, car manufacturers just don't seem to care anymore about making vehicles that last for decades. And I get it, that it's a very competitive and sometimes very low margin market. So car manufacturers are trying to cut corners and save money. But it's just a real shame that original classic cars might very well become a thing of the past, and that we as detailers are going to have to accept that we just can't work on cars the way we used to, or achieve the results that we'd like to. Well, that's just about it for part 2 of this series, which I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll leave you with the rest of the footage, but please stay tuned for part 3 and the final episode on this S500 series, in which I'll be coating and protecting the paint as well as showing you the final results. As always, I really hope you guys enjoyed and found this video useful. Please share this video, like, comment and subscribe to this channel to show your support for this content, and I'll see you guys soon.
Left and right, buzz like crazy. Everybody's trying to stimulate it. Sputters in the mirror and things can't be right. Back to the scene of a Friday night, to a blessed collision still frozen tight. Spill drinkers, Cupid and the sound of her first chime. And when did you argue? Dreaming of those eyes, the best part of my life. And when we make love, babe, the world don't make a sound. The clock won't turn around. Ooh, you turn around. You fires and no, the circle is spreading around from Mars. Keep your belly high with your pace, slowing things down when I wanted to race, catching up again when you try to chase. Feels like we're playing space. Always find a way to make up, right? Even when we're such a fly, even when things just run high, you gotta soften up your sleeves, girl. I'll never not, babe. I'm dreaming of those eyes, best part of my life. Cause when we make love, babe, the world don't make a sound. The clock won't turn around. Ooh, you turn around. You turn some little fires. And ooh, the circle is spreading around for miles. Never enough, babe. We get never enough, babe. We get never enough, babe. We get never enough, babe. And ooh, you turn it on. Try some little fires.